Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us today, and we are continuing through the Daodejing. We are in chapter 39. So let me share my screen. And we're going to just jump into the text here and start breaking it down. Of old, these attained the one. So a couple points just on this line here. The idea of attained, we can think of in the context of self-cultivation that we've been looking at. So for individuals, there's this, let's say, goal within this Taoist framework for how do we emulate more in our actions or come more into harmony with the way of Tao. And Tao, as we have seen, is sometimes also talked about as Wu, that absence, which is the one thing that actually becomes all the different things, the presence, the you. And so here, one is being talked, the Tao is being talked about as one, this idea of oneness, and how does one attain that? And it's saying of those of old, these attained the one. But what's going to be interesting is it's not going to start off talking about people, but things. And so we need to look at this idea of attained as somewhat metaphorical when it's talking about other aspects of the world. And when we get to talking about people, it's a little bit more along the lines of, self-cultivation. So it continues and says, heaven, attaining the one, became clear. Earth, attaining the one, became stable. Now I'm adding in square brackets here another way of being able to translate that, because I think when we're thinking about stable in the context that it's talking about it here, it's also very easy to translate this as peaceful. And there's different kinds of stability, and I think this is helping us to kind of orient around the type of stability that might be being brought out here. And then it says, spirits attaining the one became sacred. Now here, it can sound a little confusing, since up to this point, it appears that, the Tao Te Ching is extremely naturalistic in its outlook. But what we need to understand is how they're using these terms is a bit different than the way that we would use them. And it's entirely in keeping within more of the religious traditions within Chinese culture to use spirits and or gods, but they do tend to see those as actually part of the natural world, the best I can tell, and not like something supernatural, something outside of the natural realm. They're actually a part of it. But within this, the Tao Te Ching, it appears that they're looking at this almost more in terms of how we might think of like elemental spirits, or the idea of what is giving life to something like trees and plants and rivers and wind and that kind of a thing. And so it's often can be also translated as nature spirits or something along those lines. And then the idea of sacred can go in a lot of different directions. In our context, sacred has to do with being set apart, which doesn't quite fit with what's happening in this context here. Sometimes it's translated as, this line can get translated as God's become divine or powerful, or potent is another way that it can be translated. So I think this is along the lines of what it's trying to bring across, is that whatever this animating aspect of life in terms of like the non-human world, or non I guess animal world is what we really want to say. So it's dealing more with like the plants and such, but also the things that kind of happen that are not necessarily biological, but things like flowing water, so rivers or wind. These things would also be kind of grouped in this idea of like nature spirits, and then the idea of them being potent as a result of attaining to the one. And then valleys attaining to the one become bountiful. The myriad beings, and this is a way of translating the 10,000 things, attaining the one become fertile, but more specifically, it's actually the word for alive. And then we get to people, Lord and kings attaining the one purified the world. And this is more literally, we could say, working or acting under heaven authentically, or we could also say naturally. So I think that when they're looking at the context of like Lord or King, that this idea of how they do what they do is going to be in keeping with nature or authentic if they have attained the one. And in doing so, this translation is basically saying that it's a tough phrase that they chose, purified, because it makes it sound like there was something that is not quite right that needed to be set right that required humans to do it. And that's really not consistent with the way that the Taoists are looking at things. Um, they don't they don't see people as kind of the linchpin for making things work right, but rather kind of the thing that can throw the wrench into the gears, right? We can mess things up, but the best way for us to not mess things up is to get out of the way. Not that we need to properly control it or manage it or in this case, purify it. So I think that if we were to look at a more literal translation, then that their job as kings and rulers is to act authentically or naturally in what they're trying to do in terms of their rulership. And it will have that kind of effect, or they'll be able to do that if they also have attained the one. So we've got a couple of different things then where we see key aspects of the world in terms of heaven and the spirits and the valleys and the 10,000 things, all in the earth, all having some aspect of them that is manifest as a result of them metaphorically attaining the one. But we really need to understand that as because they're already acting in harmony with the one, this is why they have those characteristics. So recall when we were talking about Da in the previous chapter, that it sometimes is translated as nature because it has to do with something that is perfectly uh, exhibiting the way of Tao. And so all the things that we see in nature, whether we're talking about a mountain, a river, a tree, a dog, whatever, those are all perfectly uh, demonstrating their harmony with Tao. Humans are the ones that become tricky because we can get it in our heads to try and do something contrary. So when it's talking about, heaven and earth attaining the one, it's metaphorical language about the fact that they're properly representing it. But when we get to then the lords and kings, this is now something that's dealing more with the idea of actually needing to have that self-cultivation to be actually in alignment with the one. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
All right. So let's now see where this goes from here. It says, if heaven were not clear, so this clears what it attains because of its, or what it achieves because it's attained to the one. The translation says, if heaven were not clear, it might split. But there's a key word in here that's used throughout each of these, which is the word for fear, Kong. And if we look at the Chinese character there, it's the top portion of that is two characters that make up the word for bind. And then the bottom character you might recognize, Zen, I think is how you pronounce it, that is for that heart mind. So it's binding the mind. And this is how we think about fears. It like freezes your mind. It stops you from thinking clearly, right? So there's something about fear that if heaven were not manifest in the way that it does because of its attainment of the one, it might just like split apart. And the same kind of thing now happens with the earth. If the earth were not stable or peaceful, I fear it might erupt, right? So even though this translation is not including that line fear, I think we need to be aware that it's there, because how would this happen? How would heaven not be manifesting the one or attain it, right? If it's a natural process, it's naturally doing it, then it's going to demonstrate the thing that it is. In this case, it's saying clear. And obviously, this isn't like it's a bit of hyperbole in the sense that obviously there's times when it's cloudy and so forth, right? But it's the idea that there's this aspect of the sky that makes it what it is. But if it wasn't like that, it could come apart, right? Which is an undoing, something that would definitely not be natural in that sense. And the same thing with the earth. If it were not stable or peaceful, it might erupt. And currently, obviously, in the uh, midst of the Warring States period, they might be thinking this is kind of what's going on, that things are coming undone, right? That it might feel like the elemental aspects of life, the sky or the earth, are just not this peaceful, stable place or clear, but things are unraveling. Same thing then with the elemental spirits. It's saying if they were not, in this case, potent, I fear that they might fade, right? That they would disappear, that thing that gives life to all the things that we see in the non animal world. And if the valleys were not bountiful, fear that they might wither, that all the bounty that happens from the valley would just dry up. If the myriad beings or the 10,000 things were not fertile or alive, says that he fears that they might perish. And then finally, if the rulers and lords were not noble. So here we're taking this idea from the first half that if they were attaining to the one, then they would purify all under heaven, right? So the way that they're kind of grouping that back together here is this idea of being noble. So if the rulers and lords were not noble, if they had lost their attainment of the one, the fear is that they might stumble. Now, what I think is trying to be brought out in this first part is, there's a way that things are supposed to be. If something was going actively against it, it threatens the whole system. Because if everything is all interconnected and everything is part of this one, you can't have something going off the rails in one area that's not going to affect all these other different aspects of life that we experience. So this is where that concern comes in. That fear is that if humans in their cultivation are off track, it could have widespread implications in terms of how this would unfold. And again, thinking about this in the context of the Warring States period, you can see where they would say, that this kind of chaos is being unleashed. Excuse me. And I think that is going to lead nicely into the next portion here. So it says, therefore, the noble, so we're talking again about the lords and the kings, has the humble as its root, high has the low as its foundation. So, anybody want to take a stab at what you think this might be referring to in the context of what we're talking about?
It reminds me of like there is no light without dark or heavy without light, lightweight, I should say.
Okay. So there's kind of these opposites on the spectrum, right?
Yeah, although
Definitely.
I guess noble isn't necessarily a like an opposite of humble, so it may not apply there.
Well, it's
But
not a bad direction to look at that.
yeah, I mean, I guess I mean you can't have high without low, right? But also if there's something up high, it needs to be supported by something down low.
Yeah. And so it's talking about this idea of foundation, right? So if we're thinking about rulers and their foundation is something that is below them, what is that?
Humility, being humble.
Well, not in terms of attitude, but if rulers are the high, what is the low that is the
Mm,
foundation?
all of the people.
Exactly. Right. So we've got then a very interesting, let's say, reminder to the ruling class. By the way, the only thing that keeps you up there is everybody down here. Right. And so this becomes an interesting point to consider that, you can't necessarily be a king if you don't have any subjects or a ruler or a lord. And that becomes the foundation or the root of what actually gives them their position. And there's a dependency there. Right. And so within classical China, they had an interesting concept called the mandate of heaven that they would kind of use as a way to talk about the legitimacy of somebody being in power or taking them out of power. And the mandate of heaven would be removed from a ruler if they were failing to live up to the needs of the people. It's fascinating that they were talking in this kind of language at that time frame because it sounds very almost like democratic, right? I mean, it's interesting. So here it's making that statement very clearly that those who find themselves in that higher position have to remember that their foundation, their root is all the people that are in a sense underneath them. Of course, the Taoists would very much challenge that idea of hierarchy, but they would definitely see kind of like a social positioning that's not necessarily different in terms of value, but different in terms of role that somebody has within the community. And so it says from here then that rulers and lords call themselves poor, lonely orphans. And I'm assuming this is something that they did in classical China. It's not the kind of thing we usually hear today, but the idea is that they're trying to, well, you know what? I take that back. Where we see that happening, like in our current political structures, is when somebody's trying to show that they're just like a regular Joe, that they go to the bar and they have a beer or they play golf or go fishing or whatever, right? There's definitely a way to try and identify with um, the different, what's the word I'm looking for? Uh, we don't really have like class in that sense, but in terms of the different lifestyles where they can
Just
show
want to be
that,
relatable.
yeah, trying to be more relatable. Um, would be something like this too, right? Like, I'm just one of you. You can support me because I got your back. This is somewhat kind of along those lines, is that the rulers are taking on this identity to show that they are identifying with essentially the people that they are essentially trying to say that they're responsible for. And then it concludes with they use many carriages, but have no carriage. So you might recall a while back we had a passage that talked about 10,000 chariots, and that this was a way of talking about somebody who was in control of a vast amount of military power. So the idea of many carriages here is a way of talking about, um, a sense like how far up they are on the social ladder, right? So the king or the lord might have a lot of carriages, but they act as though they don't have any carriage. They do not desire to glisten like jade. So there's this idea of this showing this wealth, this ostentatious presentation. But, and it's interesting how they translate this drop like a stone. And I'm not sure. Some have this like clanging like a stone or some other type of thing. It's be curious where they actually were going with this idea of drop like a stone. But there's this continuing devaluation of not, and maybe this needs to be seen in more of the ideal sense, that the rulers should be looking at themselves more like the everyday person, that they shouldn't look at these multiple carriages. They shouldn't look at the possibility of all these valuable things as something that should be displayed to demonstrate their position or their power, but rather they should be more like a simple stone. Um, and so perhaps then when we look at this statement, this might be a call to action more than a description of reality with what's happening during that warring states period, because obviously people are trying to gain control. And how do you do that? How do you move into a position of trying to conquer and gain control if you're not addressing it from a position of a fair amount of hubris, right? That I am worthy, I am talented, I have the solution to the problem. I just need to gain control, in this case through force. That's very different from a way of looking at your position in society. But if we think about the first half, we can see how the implication is this is the way of everything in the universe, right? Heaven, earth, spirits, the valley, 10,000 things, all of them are acting in harmony with the one. And because they're doing that, they are doing the things that they need to do. Rulers, if they do what they need to do, will be also doing the right things. But if they're not, it's like everything has the possibility for coming undone. So if we look at the characteristics that were given for each of the different categories, then we can almost see this as like a list of attributes or characteristics that one would uh, attain if they attain the one, right? If you become more in tune with or in balance or in harmony with the Tao, then some of the things we might be able to expect is clear, or we might think of this in terms of for humans as like this idea of having some clarity of thought, being able to see clearly, this idea of being stable or peaceful, of potent, of being effective at what we're able to do, bountiful, alive, authentic. And of course, the not being in alignment would challenge all these things, right? But probably the biggest statement of the passage is that to forget the one is to invite disaster, to threaten, in this sense, the very biosphere itself, which is quite significant. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen here and we can see if you have some thoughts or you'd like to talk about any of those aspects. Even though it's
I
kind of a
know.
long passage, it was a little bit easy to go through.
Yeah. I can't imagine who wouldn't want all of those things, like
Mhm.
clarity and authenticity.
So why do you think that people would approach it differently?
Maybe they just don't understand how to keep things simple. I don't know.
Yeah, so there could be thoughts that there's a different way to do it, right? Maybe they're not convinced that the way to it is through this natural way. It might be seen as weak or foolish, or that somebody who's coming at it from a position of power and strength is going to overpower somebody who's trying to come at it from more of a natural perspective. That concern has come up several times in even our own group discussions.
Yeah, that's true. Like they're kind of afraid to, or they could be afraid to like release control or, trust in doing that.
Yeah, it does become kind of an interesting question about trust, right? Uh, because it can seem maybe more natural that if you want to control something that you have to use this force or overwhelm or become like an authority figure in order to control. To say that you'll be more effective by not doing that takes a little bit more of that trust that you're saying.
Yeah, it's like a trust fall with the universe.
Exactly. Trust fall with the universe.
I think one of the key problems with it is the fact that people have found other ways. Like even just looking in today's climate, fear mongering is such a huge way to control. Why would they go the right way, where it's being authentic and real and honest and humble and all of the good qualities, when they can just use fear mongering to get people to do what they need to do? It's I hate to say it, but it's easier.
Yeah,
It's
I mean,
not right, but it's easier.
you definitely get that knee-jerk reaction, right? It's kind of almost automatic. But it's interesting when we think about playing the fear card. Their definition of fear here had the idea of binding the mind. And I think you definitely see some of that even in our current political climate where fear is being used. It's almost like people stop using their brain.
Yeah, you definitely see a lot of that.
So, what do you think about the diagnosis that's happening in this chapter that if leaders resort to that, that it's going to cause all the rest of the structure to kind of come undone? Do you think that we're experiencing some of that in our own situation?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like we see all sorts of problems, like economically, politically, even just naturally with the climate. Like it all, in some degree, because of the selfishness of it, it has a cascading effect. It's not just in one place; it's kind of everywhere. Um,
But do we actually witness the undoing of those who cause it? It feels like that, whatever happens, there's no account. There's no holding anybody to account. There's no consequences, and it's just like we're not gonna see that we've burned the earth to ground until we've burned the earth to ground, and then there's gonna be no one to be held to account. And like all the decisions that we're making in the geopolitical conflicts, we can people are dying left, right, and center, and no one's being held to account. Like it's just like, yeah, it's happening. We see some consequences, but no one's being undone.
So I think that this passage that we were just looking at might have some thoughts on how to address that. Um, do you
Eat
can
the rich.
Eat the rich. So where in the passages that we just looked at might you see something along those lines of where that accountability lies?
People being the support.
The foundation. Yeah.
Yes, you said like you're not gonna be up there without those below, right?
Right. So ultimately, then, this is where that source and a sense of accountability can come from, is ultimately if 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 who you're trying to support is no longer feeling like they are being supported and it becomes an unruly mess, then ultimately the idea of being able to control or lead is going to be challenged. In classical China, it was the idea of the mandate of heaven being taken away because the leader was no longer meeting the needs of the people. So, it's, and this isn't to say anything more than understanding the relationships. And this is, I think, where Taoism is very fascinating, is it's trying to understand the patterns, trying to understand how things actually are, so that whatever action is taken, it's taken from a position of understanding. And so part of understanding the political arrangement then is to recognize the dependencies. So we even have in our current political situation another element where it's not just the political control, but we have the economic control, in the sense that there's a lot of corporate capture of our government systems because of how money is involved. But even in those corporate situations, they are still dependent on somebody buying something, right? So there's still this bottom line where there's that dependency on people participating in the economic system, buying the products, investing in the things, valuing money the way that they value it, that's still actually required for even these tremendous organizations to exist. So that would be not necessarily helping us to understand what the solution is, but to understand a little bit more about how the power dynamics work in order to think about how change might be accomplished.
But is it really actionable, right? Like, I I don't know if I've ever felt so powerless in my voting, or the lack of faith in my vote meaning anything. Like the systems not being, oh, actually, maybe I should say the other way around. Systems being set up for the way that my vote doesn't matter, or many people's vote doesn't matter. And my choices don't actually matter because the people that are presented to me as an options both suck, or all four of them suck, whatever it is, right? And me making me stepping up and saying, you know what, I'm gonna go in and do it myself is extremely difficult. And I still am gonna be part of the system that's set up for me to continue the thing. I'm not gonna have much of a power alone to change a lot of things. And it just takes so much effort and so much work from so many people at once to be aligned for a single purpose, to then gain enough power to be able to make changes. And that's just, and setting up the system so that it's difficult to do so. And it's just everything being the result of those that came before us, and again, the inability to hold people to account is just. And I would even maybe even say that even if we do hold people account by, you know what, we're gonna change the governor or prime minister or premier or whatever you have, what have you, then they just lose their power. But is that really holding them to account? Is that really holding them to accountable for what changes they have pioneered and pushed through that caused harm in whichever way to whichever section of the society? It's like, or when it comes to the trials you see in the US with Trump, like there's so much piling on. Yet, do you think he's ever going to spend a day in a jail, if ever? do you think that there's going to be any world leader held accountable for the war crimes that their country causes in any other country? Hardly, hardly. And I just don't necessarily think that while we know how it works, while we may have an idea of what should potentially happen, you don't have the means to make it happen.
Yeah, it's I think the challenge that you have is the system, I think, is in a sense rigged, like you're saying, to keep us essentially barely able to survive. So most of our energy is spent on making sure we've got enough money coming in the door just to get our rent paid and food on the table.
Mm-hmm.
And because we have to expend that extraordinary effort on trying to just keep things going, we don't have the energy or the inclination to figure out how to organize and gather to affect change. And
Yeah.
that's one of the mechanisms whereby the system maintains its power. And
Mm-hmm.
secondarily, it allows just enough of benefit that we don't want to lose what we have.
Yes.
So there's kind of a two-edged sword there. There's enough of a carrot that we don't want to lose what we have, but also we're too busy to think about, is this the way it should be? Or if it's not the way we think it should be, how do we do something about it? And that's kind of a little bit of a stalemate, but it eventually, I suspect, goes too far. And I'm sensing that in a lot of different areas in our world today, where a lot of systems that were unquestionable are now being questioned and being rethought because things have been going to such extremes. Speaking very specifically and carefully on this particular point, because I know it's a very hot button issue for a lot of people, the situation with Israel and Palestine. In the US, for a long time, it was just unthought of to question Israel. It was like a political third rail that you just couldn't go against. The situation now is really bringing that into question for a lot of people. And I think even around the world. This is not to say anything about what Israel has suffered because of what happened with Hamas, and it's not getting into all of the situation that Palestine has had to suffer as essentially an occupied country. So, not trying to unravel that at all, but just in terms of some things that were unthinkable are now become thinkable. In the US, we also have an interesting situation with, as Martin brought up, with Trump and even Biden in this case, that is causing people to really think about a lot of things that they had never thought about before. Because the question is, how do we get to this such absurd state of this being what's going on? It feels like we're watching some kind of dystopian movie of the future. It's presenting like the most ridiculous things that you would think, oh, that could never happen, but yet here we are. We're actually in it. I think about, what was that movie? I think it was Demolition Man or something like that, where all the radio stations, the only thing they play are commercial jingles. And there's like only one restaurant and it's Taco Bell. And, you think, oh, how ridiculous. But then it almost feels like we're living in that kind of world. At a certain point, there's going to be that tipping where it no longer is going to be enough to just take that little bit that we have, or to fall in line because we don't have the energy. At a certain point, if people lose enough, it's like they say, if you've got nothing less to lose, then there's no controlling somebody like that. Those kinds of systems, when they get completely out of whack, ultimately get to that kind of point. And ideally, we don't want to get there if we can avoid it, because that's not not actually a healthy thing for anybody. And it also sets you up in the midst of some type of real chaos, like with the Warring States period, to invite essentially a strong man into the picture in order to bring peace and stability. So going into a state of full rebellion or revolution can also have disaster effects, because you might just swap out, you know, one boss for a new boss. It's the same kind of boss, it's just a different name, right? And so you've got to maybe what is going to be more helpful is, instead of how to think about overthrowing a system, I like the phrase, how do we overgrow a system? And that's where I like a lot of the ideas that I'm seeing within the Daodejing, because it reminds us how interconnected everything is. And in those interconnected systems, things that can seem small can actually be significant. That small is not insignificant, and how those relate to each other and how that can have a ripple effect can be quite profound. And also knowing that things switch positions, that yin yang, or as we would talk about, like that pendulum swings both ways, that being able to pay attention to what's going on, how we develop and cultivate within ourselves a certain way of being that can also have an impact on those around us, can have a ripple effect that can actually change things, not necessarily through, like I said, revolution, but more like evolution, overgrowing the system rather than overthrowing the system. And that's what I am hopeful for in our current world situation, because like I said, the other can be just as disastrous as the current, but we'll have to see kind of how that unfolds. What kind
I'd
of
also
a
like to
place
add,
is this now?
I'd also like to add that time does take a place in this as well, that is often overlooked, where sometimes what everyone would like now is for this stuff to change immediately. And in some cases you can, especially in the world we live in with things going viral and all that fun stuff. But real process changes take time. And that is factoring a lot of things. If you're looking at politics at like the federal level, it's people aren't retiring. They're aging out by, unfortunately, dying, is the case for a lot of that. And you're starting to see the younger generation slowly move in. And as that new generation moves in, you'll see changes. But like also, like Jim mentioned, the foundation is the people. And we forget there are other layers to, I'll speak for the American government because that's where I'm at right now. But like, for example, look at Texas with the immigrations that's going on. They are going against what the federal government is mandating, and they are taking action. And now they're getting support from other states. So there's different levels. And like Martin, like when you said, like, how do we fix this stuff? It's hard to think about fixing something on a personal level because I'm just a software engineer. What do I do? I can't change who they bring up to be the president. And like you said, it's getting to a point where my vote doesn't matter, but things can change on different levels. And by getting things changed in your area could then get changed at your whole municipality and the counties, and eventually that gets up to a state level, and then eventually that goes to multiple states, and so on and so forth. So that change and process is slow in that manner, where like it I see it changing slowly. I see in my town, for example, is a very old town with old money, and it has been kind of falling apart over the last 20 years. It was really bad. And we've recently got new young people in the government, and they are revitalizing the town. We've got all sorts of new projects going on. There's new buildings that are getting renovated. All sorts of great things are happening, and that's just on our little town. And eventually that's going to move upwards whenever we have these new generations of people come in and that want positive change and do what's right. And it just takes time to get there. Unfortunately, where we live in today, it's hard to get the people in power that are not doing the right things out of power.
Yeah. Yep. Sometimes it is, like you said, Chaz, allowing the generational change to actually take place as well. And I think actually the knowledge of that happening and how radical that shift is going to be is part of what has resulted in the old guard digging in as hard as they have, and why we see across the board in our political system people way older than I ever remember people trying to staying in office, and way beyond what clearly is in past their ability to actually perform their job. And I'm not just talking about presidential candidates right now. I'm saying there's a lot of places we've been seeing this. So my suspicion is they see that writing on the wall, and that's part of the reason why they're clinging on so desperately to the existing system, because I think it is going to go through a change, and I think it will be significant as more of the younger voices are allowed to be heard that have a bigger stake in where things are going, because they're going to be here, right? I love the title of this book. I haven't actually read it yet, but just the name of it was something about how to be a good ancestor. I just thought is like the way we need to be thinking about this. And so far it's been more about, he who dies with the most toys wins, and that doesn't work. So hopefully we're seeing kind of a shift in that way of being.
Yes, and there's actually an example I have is one of the hot topics I've heard was that of people saying to raise the retirement age from 65 to 70. Of course, everyone's in an uproar because a lot of people don't even live that long and don't want to work until they're dead. But then you have solutions coming in from some younger generations of, okay, what's, as you said, how to be a good ancestor is setting, I saw a new proposal to actually set up savings accounts for children that are government funded, so that they are set starting out, that that money could go into college or business or whatever they want, or even a retirement, and that gives them the opportunity to potentially retire in their 50s rather than 70s. So like you said, the old guard doesn't care. They just want to keep making things good for them. But there is change coming. And again, it's slow.
Yeah.
Well, I even wonder, like, it seems like there's always very many opposing views and many opposing desires. Young people want to make sure that they have a future ahead of them, that they can actually survive, they can attain housing, they can attain their own children and be able to afford their own children. They want to afford, they make sure that other people's other people are taken care of. The older generation wants to make sure that they survive, like their pension is not diminished and taken away from them. We're currently fighting in Alberta, our provincial government is trying to exclude or take the provincial pensions out of the federal program and ruin it for everybody. Try just so the Albertan one, prevails and gets taken care of because we have the natural resources. And like you see that a lot, the diversion of opinions and the way one should live in all the various blue and red states, like how far apart they're starting to track, and just different mindsets, different generations, perhaps different styles of people, or their, what do we call it, tribes, are just trying to preserve or to force their form of living or way of living on everybody else around them. And I would not be surprised if US eventually split into two USs, because they're going to be so different from one another. And life in one state is going to be drastically different from life in another state. And like, how do you fight for your own way of living while you have to not only fight what the system was already in place, but you also have to fight those pulling in the other direction. And then maybe not even just in the opposite direction, in just like slightly different direction. Because I want what you want, but not this one part. I want this one part to be a little bit different. Existential crisis.
Yeah.
This is
And
why millennials and generation alpha is just like losing, and everybody in between is losing their mind on how we're gonna survive this world.
And this is where, that lost art of, compromise, but also how do we find a way of working for the common good? Uh, you know, that used to be something where the differences could be incorporated, and I like the imagery of harmony where, the different voices, the different tastes come together to actually make something that's bigger and more beautiful than the individual pieces. That's the thing we have to get back to, and people recognizing that I can't have my way exactly, right? Because if it was all one way, it would not be good. It's going to be detrimental for a lot of other people, and what we think is ideal, other people don't. But when we start to see that we all are in this together and we all need to find a way forward together, that's when we can, again, refocus on what is that common good and how do we provide that space for the uniqueness and not have to fight for conformity, but again, back to the idea of harmony.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we are at our time yet again. Interesting direction this conversation went. You never quite know how these things are going to unfold, but I very much enjoy our time today. Sorry it had to come to a close, but if you are watching this and you'd like to be a part of the conversation, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and you will get links for our Friday morning Zoom conversation, as well as directions if you're in the Southern California area that you can come to the live presentation. So hope to see you again next time, and be well, everyone.